1898 in India is a very interesting year for the people of India. British colonial rule is rampant as the aftermath of the 1857 rebellion sees a transition of power from the Company Raj to the Crown Raj. Britain increases their colonizing influence throughout the region to impose strict rule under the Crown. What we see in 1898 is sort of a pushback by the Indian people. There are growing frustrations with the British rule, and we start to see a growing sentiment of nationalism. During this time, the people are becoming more educated and information is readily spreading through different regions of India. We have different nationalist parties starting to gain traction and a welter of support as people become more cognizant of the exploitative economic practices of Britain. The establishment of the Indian railway system shifted India to an economic forefront that aired Britain's exploitative practices. Along with all of this, India experiences numerous famines and plagues. Britain's response to this situation garners frustration and distrust. As a result, all of these contributing factors spark a growing sense of nationalism. As we delve into this time during 1898, we shall dissect each contributing factor of this rising movement, including economy, politics, health, travel, and education. When the British created the British Raj in India in 1857, education was all over the place. There was no commonality at all, different subjects were taught, and it was taught in a variety of different languages. By 1898, education would be reformed and become one of the leading causes of nationalism in India. In 1870, Britain passed the Compulsory Education Act, which deemed education as a fundamental human right. Seeing this act passed in Britain, Indians demanded that they get similar facilities in India. In 1882, in front of the Indian Education Commission, Dadabhai Nauroji proposed a 4-year compulsory primary education system. To quote Nauroji, while every branch of education can justly claim the fostering care of the state, it is desirable, in the present circumstances, to declare the elementary education of the masses, its provision, extension, and improvement, to be that part of the educational system to which the strenuous efforts of the state should now be directed. Following Nauroji's speech, the Education Commission would pass the proposal on to Lord Ripon, who would agree with the Education Commission's findings. Education would be delegated to each state's self-government. However, the budgets for these schools were small and it wasn't free. To solve this, the self-governments told the local schools to allow a small portion of students in poverty to attend for free. The Indian National Congress would take up the education movement as the members of the Congress knew the importance of having an educated populace. Inside the schools, everything would be taught in English. The British intended to use the education system as a means to put the educated Indian elite into positions of power within the government. It would be these people who would become the leaders of the independence movement. A lot of the leaders of the Indian National Congress were made up of this educated Indian elite. Britain's original goal with the educational reform was to, quote, civilize the Indian continent and make it easier to rule. By the 1880s, English education was spread throughout India. Students around India were now having a more uniform educational experience. They were learning in a common language and learning pretty much the same things all around India. For the first time, the diverse populations of India were having a common background and language, that being English, to unify them. As touched upon before, the Indian National Congress would be born from these common perspectives, and the Indian people would begin to see themselves more as a cohesive group with a common language and educational background.
By 1898, we see that the railway systems in India had been well established. Although Western influencers would suggest this innovation by Britain advanced India's economic status and structure, looking within the lines, we see that Britain invested heavily in this infrastructure for its own gain. The railway system eventually becomes a monopolized system for the British to continue to exploit India. They established their own rates and policies, and practically no one could challenge them. The rail was controlled by a total of 5 companies, which were all British. Priority of shipment was given to the military and commerce. These British-owned companies charged different rates to maximize their profits. Lower rates were charged for shipments between 2 ports compared to transport between 2 mainland points of similar distance. Essentially, it favored export and import from ports but discouraged inland trade. As a result, India was put into a chokehold, having to serve Britain's greater interest, meaning agrarian trade continued to be enforced as opposed to industrial goods, causing India's development to essentially be hindered. So where does 1898 play a role in reference to these railways? Well, the creation of these railways created many travesties. These travesties range from deforestation, abusive labor, to misconduct within the trains. As different rail lines were being produced, the British began to ransack multiple forests, depleting them of their resources to create railway sleepers. By 1898, some 3 million trees had been harvested within that decade. To produce these railroads required lots of manual labor. Children would be put to work at an age as young as 11. The pay was extremely low and the work was enormously dangerous. Some tasks included working on cliffs, which resulted in people dying from slips, cave-ins, and just plain rocks crushing them. Deaths of European laborers were widely reported in great detail and deeply mourned, while the death of Indians went unnoticed and were recorded as just a statistic. It is to be noted that the heaviest construction years took place during 1898, when famine was at its height, as the British exploited cheap famine labor. 1898 saw an enormous increase in travel by Indians through the railway system. The travel system in place, however, contributed to several racial undertones. The ticketing system developed so that it was categorized by first class, second class, and third class passengers. First and second class were presumably higher priced and allocated for British officers and people. These tickets provided luxury and comfort. Meanwhile, third-class tickets were set aside for Indians, which resulted in overcrowded carts. This unsanitary environment resulted in transfer of illness and physical misconduct, specifically against women. Several grievances by Indians would be aired to the British, but to no avail would they respond or improve conditions. After knowing all these injustices, we juxtaposed the situation with a newspaper article in 1897 from the Scientific American. It's titled "The Great Railway Station in Bombay, India." The article then begins to talk with the British as they laud them for their extremely beautiful Victorian-influenced architecture and their generous charitable donation to India. It gives hints of racial prejudice, suggesting that India has been blessed by Britain to have such technological advancements be provided to them. At the same time, India is experiencing numerous famines and disease outbreaks and also dealing with several injustices. It speaks volumes to how closeted the mistreatment of Indians were and how truly damaging the British were. These behaviors by the British and their failure to respond to Indian grievance eventually leads to a growing resentment towards colonial rule. Indians are becoming more aware of how they are being exploited by them and through the mistreatment of labor, taken advantage of during famine and experiencing racism at a large scale. Indians are mad and they are mad together. And that is how we begin to see more and more people coming together at the national scale to get rid of colonial rule. This is the beginning of a spark that will create many movements to push for independence. Here is just a glimpse as to how the facade of the amazing railways played a role in this growing nationalism in 1898.
In colonial India, the late 19th century was riddled with famine and disease, such as cholera, malaria, plague, and fever, and as a result, we saw lots of development in the world of healthcare. If we go back a little to the year of 1891, the Census Commissioner said, among famine and epidemic disease, the most powerful in a series of years is epidemic disease, and in particular, cholera, smallpox, and fever. The investigations suggest that environment, climate conditions, and British economic policies both have affected the health of the poor people. As Saheb discussed, during the late 19th century, India saw lots of industrial growth, the growth of their ports, mines, and factories in Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, for example. Because of this growth, the census records show tremendous population growth as well, due to immigrants who came in the hopes of scoring one of the many jobs that have now opened up. We know India was already struggling economically before this immigration movement. So as the cities became overpopulated, the previously tolerable sanitation issues grew into a dire situation. The drainage, removal of waste, and supply of clean water became major issues. The working conditions at these new mines and factories were crowded and unsanitary, which created microenvironments that were ideal for the spread of disease, like the epidemic disease that were already mentioned, as well as venereal diseases contracted through prostitution, alcoholism, and industrial pollution. Those diseases were then carried back through the city and spread to the families of workers and the rest of the villages. Raja Digambar Mitra, a committee member tasked with looking into the causes of fever, found that poor village drainage was caused by railway feeders, which were surrounded by patches of water that supported mosquito breeding. Research also suggests that over 20% of deaths were caused by chronic epidemic malaria, and that from 1890 to 1920, the disease killed more than 20 million people. The tiny government budget for public health led to a serious neglect of healthcare. Only district headquarters had a hospital with a few dispensaries. The government had no infrastructure and was wholly unprepared to handle a raging epidemic, much less plural epidemics.
By 1898, the British implemented a classic colonial economy in India that sought to extract India of its resources. Since Britain was an industrialized country whose main industry was textiles, India's raw materials such as cotton, silk, and indigo were highly valuable to them. To keep up with the demands of their factories, the British deindustrialized the Indian economy and centered it around the production of cash crops and the mining of goods. Farmers had small parcels of land where they grew the crops that were most valuable for selling to trade. Because of this, they mostly grew cash crops and often didn't grow enough food to sustain them if the granary was depleted, which exacerbated famines in India. Most farmers also lived under the control of moneylenders that worked with the British to increase revenue for themselves. This kept peasant farms in a state of perpetual poverty and debt with little to no upward social movement. Despite famine commissions trying to place blame on famines on population increases and weather, the main cause for famines and plagues was the widespread poverty created by the rigid economic rules in colonial Indian society. The Indian economy was also built around mining for gold and coal for the British, and a little around factories for metal in Bombay. However, most of the Indian economy was reliant on agriculture and exporting materials at cheap prices to Britain for their textile industries. Most completed goods were imported to India by the British. This hindered India's abilities to have any power in global economics, and economists noticed that India's currency was lacking in value due to the extraction of capital, and that India was very vulnerable to an economic crisis. Ramesh Chandra Dutt linked India's poverty to Britain's discouragement of India's hand-woven textile industry, which is what India previously depended on, the outflow of money and gold from India to pay its debt, and the absence of Indian representation in Parliament. In several proposals made towards Britain's economy councils, the Indian rupee was stated to have dropped in value due to the extraction of gold from India's reserves, which made the currency less valuable. On top of that, the British weren't doing much to strengthen the Indian economy outside of their self-interests. This created widespread disillusionment with the colonial economy amongst the educated elite.
The British saw nationalism in India as a direct threat to their economic strategy, because the more political power that Indians demanded, the less the British could steer the Indian economy in their preferred direction, and the less conciliatory the British could pretend to be. In an attempt to quell and appease Indian nationalists, the British used manipulative but ultimately futile political and geographic tactics. The British designed the Indian government in a fashion that would explicitly exclude Indians from participating in politics. There were member restrictions that put minority groups at a disadvantage, and caps on seat availability, which allowed the British to control most decision-making. However, eventually, Indians became increasingly agitated by their lack of control over their own land, people, and economy. By 1898, two influential political groups had been founded, the Indian National Association and the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress was the strongest of the political groups in India, and although it started in 1885 as more of a timid debating circle, it soon harnessed the power to voice concerns regarding colonial rule and challenge Britain's position in India. However, most of their concerns pertained to the Indian elites and did not properly regard the struggles of middle and lower caste Indians. In addition to group efforts, political and spiritual leaders played a crucial role in galvanizing Indians into taking action. During this time period, a man named Dadabhai Naoroji was leading the way in terms of his ability to criticize British ruling in what some may call a constructive manner. Because, although he identified the flaws in colonial rule, he also confessed that certain parts of colonial rule were productive and beneficial for Indians. Nevertheless, his most well-known argument against British colonial rule was his drain of wealth theory. This referred to his 1867 theory that Indians were paying too large of a share on behalf of the British, and that this deficit was exacerbated by the fact that the British continued binding India to foreign markets. Largely because of his theory, the Royal Commission on Indian Expenditure was formed in 1896, and this group analyzed whether any of the financial decisions put forth by the British had encumbered India. Around 1898, Indians would feel to be on the precipice of tangible progress in building their independence against the British. But there were still anti-independence British strategies to wrestle with, such as the 1905 partition of Bengal. The partition, carried out by Lord Curzon, who served as viceroy from 1898 to 1905, was designed to suffocate the growth of Indian nationalism by separating Muslims from Hindus. This action was deeply upsetting to the Bengalis, but also to Indian nationalists far away. The reaction to the partition was the Swadeshi movement, in which Indians protested foreign goods and emphasized the importance of domestic production. This display of organized discontent for British colonial rule encouraged and fueled nationalism across the country.
As you can see, 1898 was a very tumultuous time in India. People began to become more educated and see a lot of the exploitative practices of Britain. Britain's health and economic policies started to take their toll on India during this time, as well as showcasing the relationship between Britain and India. Moving into the 20th century, nationalism in India would explode, culminating in independence in 1947.